Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming to this Issues and Ideas Forum. My name is Michael Van Beek. I'm the Director of Research at the Mackinac Center. We're very happy that you're here with us today. Also welcome our folks who are watching this online in our live stream. And just so everybody knows, a recording of this event will be available on our website after we're done here. Before I introduce the topic and our excellent panel, let me explain the agenda for today's event. We'll have each speaker will present for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll have a session of question and answers afterwards. And on your table there are cards and pens, so if you have a question as you're listening to the panelists, quick jot it down on a card, and we'll have somebody come around during the Q&A session and pick up that card for you, and then I will ask the questions of our panelists. So on this topic of ride sharing, so the first time I heard about this, I think I was in college about 15 years ago, and it was in reference to when college students would post in online forums where they wanted to go for the weekend, so that another college student would say, hey, I'm going the same direction too, and I can give you a ride. So it was literally ride sharing. Today, of course, it means something much different and has expanded way beyond college campuses. Now it refers to drivers communicating conveniently with riders via smartphones and giving them the ability to offer them a ride, and allowing riders to seamlessly transact with drivers for payments. And it's now connecting millions of drivers and riders all across the globe. You can see why it's an exciting development. It offers flexibility and well-paying jobs to drivers and cheaper and more convenient rides for consumers. But it also poses a challenge. How do we regulate a brand new disruptive innovation like this one? And more importantly, how do we regulate it in such a way that it helps reduce risks for consumers, but doesn't diminish the benefits of this type of innovation? So we're very excited to have with us today an excellent panel. And I will introduce them each, and then I'll have them present. And the first presenter is going to be Michael Farron. He is a research fellow in the Project for the Study of American Capitalism at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. His research focuses on the effects of government-granted privilege, specializing in labor, economic development, and transportation issues. Our second presenter, is going to be Senator Mike Shirkey. I've been told he's in session right now and will be running a few minutes late, so hopefully he'll come running through here. He's from the 16th District in Michigan, which includes Branch, Hillsdale, and Jackson counties. Senator Shirkey chairs two committees, the Health Policy Committee and the Michigan Competitiveness Committee, and also serves on the Elections and Government Reform and the Energy and Technology Committees. And in other words, as demonstrated, he's very busy. He's an engineer by profession, but also is an entrepreneur, having started his own engineering company. And last, we'll hear from Tim Van Dongen, who's been a driver for Uber and Lyft, and has actually worked out so well for him driving for these companies that he quit his perfectly good job as a restaurant manager, and now has become his own entrepreneur, starting his own company called Ride Media, which sets up advertising in ride-sharing vehicles. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Well, thank you to the Mackinac Center and my fellow panelists. I've been looking forward to this presentation for a while. The title of my presentation is Ride Sharing: The Right Way to Regulate. So this is a discussion much less about the right regulations, but rather the right thought process behind regulation. So you might ask yourself, why does transportation regulation matter? And a real simple example of this is that snow is pretty in a snow globe and snow is pretty in Paris, but snow is not quite so pretty when you're trying to flag down a cab in the middle of a blizzard. An outline for what I want to talk about is where have we been? I want to go into the history of transportation regulations, where we're at today with Uber and Lyft and taxis, and what does the future look like? So first off, where we've come from, this slide shows a streetscape from early 1900s. You're seeing horse and carriage, early automobiles, and electric streetcars. Electric streetcars were the main mode of urban transportation at the time, and actually the streetcars had monopolies granted by the cities that they were in, that only that streetcar company could operate a line along specific avenues, or even within the entire city. And this kind of framework set up essentially what is to come and set up the thinking behind transportation regulations. So a lot of what we're doing today is due to relics of the past that are still with us. And speaking of relics in the past, I want to take you a little even further back and give a quick story regarding red flag laws, because they're probably the best or worst example of regulatory capture that I could offer. Red flag laws were passed in England following the introduction of the automobile. And what they were is they said that each car had to be driven by 3 people. 2 people in the car, and then 1 person walking ahead of the car, waving a red flag, warning everyone that a car was coming. So who would be crazy enough or stupid enough to put these kind of laws into place? Well, they weren't crazy or they weren't stupid at all. They were encouraged by the railroad industry because they understood that cars and trucks represented a competitive advantage over trains, and that they wanted to try to keep their share of the transportation market. So as a result, England's automobile industry lapsed for about a generation, and Germany became the major automobile developer of Europe. The same sort of thing almost happened in the US, specifically in Pennsylvania. There was a law that passed both houses of the legislature, and was only stopped by a governor veto, that would have required drivers, once they met a herd of cattle or horses, to immediately stop their car, disassemble the vehicle, and then hide the pieces behind bushes until the livestock left the area. So again, these legislators were not stupid, they're not crazy, they're simply acting with the best idea at the time, but if that law had become law, it wouldn't have turned out best for the rest of us. So combining the streetcar example and this idea of regulatory capture, we come to the story of the jitney cab. And this is something that very few people know about, but 100 years ago, there was another version of Uber that got regulated out of existence because it challenged the existing streetcar monopolies. So there was an economic recession, a lot of people out of work, and they turned to earning money the best way they knew how, which is a lot of what Uber and Lyft drivers are doing today. In between jobs, how can I make some cash? I have a car, let me give people rides for money. And so it provided better service than streetcars, faster door-to-door type service, and it became a huge thing that was actually called the jitney phenomenon. It went from the first ride in July of 1914 to a year later, there were 62,000 jitneys across the US in 175 cities. And there was actually an entire subculture spawned where there's over a dozen songs about jitneys written at the time. But because they challenged the existing streetcar monopolies, and consequently the taxes that those monopolies paid to city governments, they were regulated out of existence. So the result was really high licensing fees, really high insurance rates, everything that they could think of. That they weren't essentially allowed to compete with streetcars. They were only allowed to be supportive of streetcars because that was the favored child of city governments. So the same thing happened about 10 to 15 years later during the Depression. Again, people out of work looking to make money any way they could, so they got taxi licenses and went to work as taxi drivers. But the existing taxi companies said, whoa, 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 we don't like this competition. In fact, it's driving down the rates that we get. We're not getting as much revenue or profit. So city fathers, please help us out, pass regulations. We want you to regulate us. So this is another version of regulatory capture. Rather than saying, we want you to regulate the new industry, we want you to regulate our industry and create really high barriers to entry so that entrepreneurs can't come in and challenge us. And so that's exactly what happened. They put in taxi license limits. They put in restrictions on the kind of vehicles that you could use so that people couldn't use their personal cars. And then they put in fare mandates or price controls. And so as a result, we, for the last 80 years, have had less supply, less quality, and higher prices, and longer walks home in the rain as a result. So where are we at today? Now, you can raise your hand and hail a taxi on the street if you so desire, or you can use your smartphone and call an impressively handsome Uber driver to take you to your destination. But the quick emergence of Uber and Lyft has led to almost, it seems, a rush to regulate. In the last 2.5 years, almost every state has either passed a law or has started considering a law regarding what do we do about this new transportation innovation. The laws really vary between states. The TNC licensing fees range from small levels of about $1,000 a year in West Virginia to really high levels in Colorado of like $100,000 a year. Insurance rates are more standardized, but the level that is stipulated at $1 million that seems acceptable to Uber and to Lyft might be a problem for new entrepreneurs trying to enter the market, because that level of insurance is obviously not cheap, and it's nowhere close to the amount of insurance required for taxis previously. And then also, the laws in some states are following old taxi laws in the way that they're carving up the transportation industry. They can't, some states say that you can't have Uber cars with more than 8 passengers. Why not? Nobody ever really provides a reasoning why. So one of the ideas is, why cut up the transportation industry into taxis, limos, charter vans, things like this? Why not have one set of rules applying to all transportation service providers? In addition, some of the troubling aspects that have come out of these laws is that they seem to be catering a little bit too closely to the Uber and Lyft business model. And I'm not saying that it's a bad business model, but once you enshrine certain ways of doing business or certain ways of complying with regulation into law, you automatically forestall any new innovations or entrepreneurship outside of that area. One interesting development that's probably been pretty good is states mandating that local areas cannot pass more restrictive regulations. And if you just think about it, if you were to drive from here to Detroit or Chicago and you had to get a new driver's license every time you entered a new county or a new city, you would end up with a lot less travel. Well, if you cause it so that you have to have a new license for every city that you're in, it's very likely that you're going to end up with a lot less transportation services being offered, and essentially a lot less public welfare being created by providing rides to customers that are willing to pay for them. So where are we headed going forward? There's been some troubling developments and some good developments. In a couple cities in Florida, they've actually started subsidizing Uber as a proxy for public transit. And in some other larger cities like Atlanta and Dallas and Los Angeles, they've been talking with Uber and looking at how do we form a partnership between our existing transit agencies and your operation. So this is troubling because what might happen is another version of the streetcar monopolies, that the companies may just end up being franchised the same way, or at least de facto franchised by the cities that they're in. Or it might simply be that the old taxi regulations that have created high barriers to entry due to insurance regulations, mandates on how you provide service, or mandates on business models might end up limiting the ability for new entrepreneurs to come in and challenge the existing service providers, which that is exactly how you keep prices low and you keep quality high, because companies are always scared of losing business. If you don't have that, if they feel a measure of protection from these barriers to entry or from favoritism from governmental policies, then you end up with the same terrible taxi policies we've had for the last 80 years. So, but is some good developments in Florida particularly. So Florida represents both the worst and the best examples of this. There's some cities that have actually fully deregulated their transportation industries. There's other cities that are making sure that they actually treat transportation service providers, whether they're taxis or their TNCs, the same way. And so that is a good example of how to go forward. So how do we go forward? How do we ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past? One way is to abide by the principle of generality of application, that the same rules apply to everybody who's competing in the same industry. The second one would be low barriers to entry. Generality is all well and good, but if you have high barriers to entry, you have this level of protection from new entrants into the industry, entrepreneurs, startups, that as a result kind of grant a degree of monopoly privilege or protectionism to the established companies, and you get lower service and higher prices as a result. And then, just as importantly, not mandating specific business models or mandating this is how you shall comply with regulation, but instead saying we're going to allow permissionless innovation. You can do anything that you want within reason, but here's simply the regulatory outcomes that we would like you to ensure that occur. So that gives you the ability to innovate in compliance and therefore create better outcomes into the future and avoid the 8-decade-long malaise that occurred in the taxi industry. And lastly, our great-grandparents didn't get it right. Our great-great-grandparents didn't get it right. We're probably not going to get it right too. So we need to have a little bit of humility and a little bit of intellectual honesty and say, okay, we're probably not going to get it exactly right, the right regulations. But if we come back in 5 years and say, let's take another look at these regulations, let's build in some sunset clauses that provide the structure to allow us to say, all right, what did we get wrong? How did we stifle the industries unintentionally? And what new problems have come up as a result that we need to address? That's probably the best way to avoid more long, rainy walks home in the future. Thank you.
Everybody, my name is Tim Van Dungen. Like Mike said, I'm an Uber driver in Ann Arbor. I also float around to a lot of different cities. I was Ubering this morning in Lansing. It was pretty busy today. I was pretty happy. Ride sharing is important to me because it gave me the opportunity to leave my career in the restaurant management business. That was last year, to just pursue bigger and better things. After a few months of driving, I came up with the idea of my business called Ride Media, because a lot of passengers asked for suggestions on where the hot spots in town were. In Uber, when you're a driver, it just makes you feel like an entrepreneur out there, because you're driving and you could log off and go do something else, or you could stay logged on for the next 9 hours if you want to. So you really don't have a boss. It's a great feeling to have, and that kind of spurred all my ideas for going into my business. But it's also very important to many other drivers across Michigan. I'm an administrator for some of the Facebook groups about Uber. I've heard a lot of stories. I've talked to a lot of people. A lot of people who are unemployed use it to get extra money, but is also great for networking. But right when I left my job and became an Uber driver, I had a lot of offers for employment. It's just great to network in that way. It's also great for people who are underemployed. Maybe their hours get cut, or they just have a seasonal job somewhere. It's great for retired people. It's also great for just supplemental income, whether you're an entrepreneur like me, if you're a bus driver who has 5 hours during the day to really do nothing between runs. Or I've met some people who just use it. They're saving up for their kids' college fund. And then some people use it as their only income. They love talking to people. They love driving. It's great for them too. And then of course a lot of passengers depend on ride sharing. Some people use it on a daily basis. I Ubered this woman in Ann Arbor. She was a nurse at the hospital, and she sold her car because she figured it was cheaper to use Uber. She only worked 3 days a week. She sold her car. It cost her like $100 a month to use Uber to get to and from work. And they realized that her car, that car that she drove, that car was the only purpose for that, is just to do that. So that was saving them like $500 a month just in that. I also heard stories about just people in Detroit or in less fortunate areas who don't have their car, wreck their car or whatever. They can get cheap, affordable, safe rides to and from doctor's appointments for their kids or even for themselves. Also, people use it to get to and from the bar at night. There's been a lot of stats out there that it cuts down drunk driving deaths and occurrences. If the wrong legislation is passed, the cost for drivers to do this is going to increase. There'll be more licensing that'll be involved. And it's going to phase out a lot of the part-time drivers. And if there's less part-time drivers, you're not going to get the coverage for the peak times, like during the bar times. And there's a chance that someone who is drunk might say, oh my God, there's no Ubers. I guess I just have to drive home. And that would not be a good thing. It also costs more money for passengers because the prices could surge high because there just isn't enough drivers out there because it's a supply and demand type of thing. In worst case scenario, the transportation network companies, Uber, Lyft, they would no longer be able to provide safe rides in Michigan. And I believe it would kill a free market concept, and it would keep Michigan in the dark ages when it comes to innovation. That's it.
All right, while we wait for Senator Shirkey, let me take a moment just to update everybody on sort of the current state of this issue in Michigan. The Michigan legislature last year passed statewide regulations of transportation network companies that do a lot of the, so it provides a statewide framework, requires a certain level of insurance, requires background checks of drivers, and addresses the safety concerns that a lot of people have with these kinds of services. It does a lot of things that Michael talked about in his presentation. And then on the, but that bill currently is sitting in the Senate, and the Senate has its own version of regulations for transportation network companies. And it basically does the same thing that the House version does, but then adds on additional regulations. So it requires drivers and the companies to meet the Limousine Transportation Act that Michigan has, which is about 25 years old. And then it also allows local municipalities and cities to add on additional regulations of these companies if they so choose. So that's kind of the state of where we are right now in Michigan. And that's why we think that this is an important issue right now, because we have these sort of conflicting concepts of how best to regulate these services. While we're waiting, I will take the opportunity to just ask you guys some questions. If you all have questions based on the two presentations we've heard so far, please put those on a card, and we'll have somebody come around and pick them up for you. Michael, I want to ask you a question about sunset clauses. So regulatory capture is an issue. My concern is if we have sunset clauses, does that provide an opportunity for more regulatory capture, which is we might not get the perfect regulation, but if we get it done well enough, maybe that's as good as we can get. But if we continually sort of open this up for additional discussion, will that provide more opportunity for industries to capture the regulation?
Certainly. It definitely would provide more opportunities to capture the regulation, but also provide more opportunities to do away with regulatory capture as well. And in some cases, you can end up having inadvertent regulatory capture where you just, the way that the technology moves over time, that it's kept taxis essentially in the dark ages. Taxis are still using technology from 20, 30, even 40, 50 years ago. And so without the incentive to actually push forward the regulatory structure, there may not be the greatest outcomes that in terms of providing customer service that we would otherwise have. So yeah, it definitely has potential for more regulatory capture, but it's a two-sided coin. It could go the other way too.
Okay, thanks. Tim, I was wondering if you could tell the audience a little bit about the kinds of safety checks and concerns that it seems like a lot of the concerns that people have about these services is a safety issue. I wondered if you could just talk about your experience with that issue and how, if you think it could be improved, how these companies do checks and background checks and things like that.
Well, it took about 2 weeks for me to even be able to drive for Uber because of all the extensive background checks. They run state, local, and federal background checks, criminal record, driving record, and I think that would probably that would definitely exceed any other company for taxis. And it's a very transparent system. When an Uber arrives, you know exactly what their name is. You know what their license plate number is. You have a picture of their car, so you know exactly whose car you're getting into.
I wonder if I could get both of you to weigh in on this. Where do you see this technology moving forward? Michael, you made a point of creating regulation in such a way that we allow for permissionless innovation, so that new ideas that we haven't thought of yet can exist and can operate. So I'm wondering, can this move beyond just the car for hire service, delivery services, school transportation, and then also what are the challenges from a regulatory perspective on additional services?
So I think that the most interesting potential future coming out of this is that it may change the face of urban mass transit as we know it. I think that is just my own absolute personal opinion. I think that's one of the reasons why transit companies are now trying to partner with Uber and Lyft, because they may see the writing on the wall that essentially with the crushing of the jitneys 100 years ago, you lost the ability to have for-hire carpooling into work each day. And so it created this system where now every family had to have a car or multiple cars for people to go to work each day. Kind of like you said, Tim, your example of the nurse, she's sold her car now and just Ubers into work. So in the same way, the advantage that Uber and Lyft and the jitneys had over bus lines and over the streetcars 100 years ago was that they were able to deviate from the main transportation trunk lines where the rails ran or where the bus lines are. And so I see a potential future where you're going to have more small private transit operations. And the only reason why we have public transit operations is that the streetcars moved into buses, and then the buses couldn't compete with the private auto, so they started being subsidized by the cities. So this is finally our chance to actually get a private
mass transit structure working in a way that is actually profitable.
Tim, obviously you've identified a entrepreneurial opportunity, right, with advertising in these vehicles.
Right.
What other things have you seen? I mean, have you heard other ideas for how to take sort of this innovation, this concept, and apply it to different services potentially?
I think delivery. I think there's going to be a lot of things that come off this is delivery services. Uber has tested a lot of things like Uber ice cream. I did Uber ice cream last summer. It was pretty fun. You really are just, you use the app and you can order ice cream from your Uber driver. It was from a local company, which is awesome. I think it was Detroit Popsicle Company, Detroit Pop Shop, I think is what it was called. So it supported a local company. Uber probably bought 1,000 popsicles from this place and sold them on the streets of Detroit. And I think they did something like they sold ugly sweaters. Use your Uber app to order an ugly sweater in Ann Arbor. So just a lot of things the platform can be used for. And there's actually something going on in Detroit tonight. It's between 1 and 5. It's this thing called Uber Pitch, and on the app you select Uber Pitch, and somebody in an Uber car, an investor in an Uber car, is going to come and listen to your pitch. I think you get like 10 minutes. So actually, right after this, I'm going to be heading to Detroit to hopefully get an Uber Pitch vehicle and talk to an investor in an Uber car, I hope. So yeah.
Thanks. So we talked a little bit about the safety concerns that passengers might have of drivers. Can you discuss a little bit the flip side of that, the concerns that drivers might have of passengers, and how do transportation network companies deal with this issue, and are there ways that we could deal with it better?
I think they deal with it good. I mean, Uber has all of their information. They have their credit card number, their address, their name, and everything. So I've never felt endangered driving whatsoever. But I think the transparency of it all is that everybody, both sides know you know each other already, just based on the app and the information that Uber has.
And can you explain how the rating system works, right? Like riders can rate drivers and drivers can rate riders, right? So how does that?
Uber drivers, they're required to rate every passenger based on how the trip went. And passengers, I think it's optional for a passenger to rate a driver, but drivers have to rate the passenger. And if their rating is low, you get kicked off the system. If they get a bad complaint, I'm sure they get kicked off the system, so they will never be able to use an Uber again.
From what I've used Uber, I've been required to provide a rating for my driver before I can ever get another, before I can order another Uber.
Okay.
So even if I had forgotten 3 days later, I still have to rate the driver that I had 3 days earlier.
And you may not even remember.
Yeah, that's actually from an economist perspective in terms of like designing the right structure. That's exactly the kind of structure that you'd want to have.
Right.
In regard to driver safety, that's actually something that I found very interesting, that a lot of the TNC laws, essentially all of them, mandate that the passenger be provided with a picture of the driver, a description of the car, and the car's license plate to appropriately identify that. The laws don't mandate that the same information be provided to the driver. So the driver doesn't really know necessarily what the passenger looks like. They do in the Uber and Lyft apps because it's set up that way, but it's not mandated to be set up that way. And that's interesting because taxi drivers actually had one of the absolute most dangerous professions there is. Literally, more taxi drivers are killed, murdered on the job, and assaulted than police officers. And that's one of the reasons why you see bulletproof glass shields in some large cities that they've mandated. So the fact that the Uber app and these new systems are actually making it safer both for drivers and for passengers. And there have been a couple of situations. I believe there was an Uber driver shot recently, but they caught the person that did it, because you can't get in the car without a GPS location of where you are at all the time, and a personally identifiable information. It's the anonymity of street hails that makes taxi driving so dangerous, and these new systems completely solve that.
So we've talked a lot about Uber specifically, and I just want to clarify that this is not necessarily just about Uber. Obviously, they're sort of like the major player here. But Michael, I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned this briefly in your presentation about making sure that our regulations don't sort of encapsulate a particular company or even a particular means of doing business. So could you flesh that out a little bit more, and what kinds of things should we do from a regulatory standpoint to make sure that we're not just allowing a different company or a different industry to capture the regulation?
Gotcha. So I guess that maybe this is too basic, but start out with the idea of what is the purpose of the regulation. That's at the core. What should we be doing? Generally, it's public safety. We want to ensure that, especially because you're providing this service in the public thoroughfare, that there's some assurance that the anonymity problem, or as economists will call it, the asymmetric information problem, that when you get into the car, you don't know whether or not the driver is deranged, and the driver doesn't know if the passenger is an ex-murderer. But although that's relatively solved by the Uber app. So go into it with a clear idea of what are you trying to regulate, and then only go toward that goal. So requiring that identification be provided to the passenger and the driver, that's something that meets that goal. Requiring that drivers be independent contractors rather than employees, or requiring that payments be done via credit card instead of cash. Those are things that might be useful to the current business models of the companies, but they might not be necessarily necessary along the lines of fulfilling that regulatory objective. And if Uber and Lyft or some other company does get into the private version of mass transit in the future, they may decide that, no, really, we want some of our workers to actually be employees, because we don't want to depend upon just whether or not we have enough drivers show up for work. People that are going to work want to make sure that they have a standard thing that they can count on, like a bus route. So in that situation, they may want employees rather than independent contractors. So they may be shooting themselves in the foot to push too hard for that. That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about.
I have a question here about this issue with regards to airport transportation to and from airports. One person writes in that this is one of the big issues related to transportation network companies. Tim, I don't know if you've done a lot of transporting people to and from airports, but this person asks, is there a free rider argument for regulating TNCs here? Because the person says that the taxi and limo fees fund some of the airport services. So is it potential that TNCs would get a free ride from the fees that taxis and limo services pay? And then if that's true, what do we do about that?
I know for a fact that there's a $5 surcharge on every airport pickup and drop off. So that goes, I'm assuming that goes to the airport. Also, they have like Uber Black, like the premium car service. They actually are kind of treated just like a taxi. So they go like where the taxis pick up, and I think they pay $10 to pick somebody up from like the taxi cab line. What was the first part?
Just the so so you're saying that driving for TNCs, you're also paying this fee?
The passenger does.
The passenger is paying
Yeah, the
fee.
passenger
Okay.
pays it.
Okay, so I think the basis of the question is, should there be sort of a different regulatory structure for transportation to and from airports? Is that fundamentally different than what we've mainly been talking about here, which is, you know, inter and intra-urban transportation?
So this is kind of an example of generality of application. So if you want to pick a passenger up from an airport or drop them off, if you're in a taxi, you have to pay a fee. It makes sense that if you are paying someone else to take you, whether it's a taxi driver, a limo driver, an Uber or Lyft driver, that you have to pay the same sort of fee. At the end of the day, the airport's providing a service, a place for planes to land and for you to access the planes. So they have to cover their costs somehow. So if they don't cover their cost through access fees just to get into the airport, then they're going to have to cover their costs through higher fees they charge to the airlines, which will then be passed on to passengers via higher ticket prices. So it's just the cost has to be covered somehow. It's just a matter of it being equally applied to everybody.
Michael, you mentioned in your presentation some cities in Florida who have gone to deregulating their taxi industry. Can you talk more about details of how that works, and if you think that's sort of a necessary component of this issue?
So I don't know if it's a necessary component. It's a fabulous experiment, I think, in the right direction, and we'll have to see what occurs as a result. But yes, Sarasota and Collier County have completely done away with all of their for-hire vehicle transportation regulations. And the city and the county officials essentially said, we're supposed to have kind of a market-based economy and free enterprise and encourage entrepreneurship, and these existing taxi laws don't do that at all. They completely restrict things, and fare mandates, price controls are the worst example of that. So I haven't heard of any problems so far. They've essentially said we're just going to do away with all of their regulation and not enforce the non-regulation. If you want to flag down a random car and get into it and pay the driver for a lift, that works. You, by then, are assuming the responsibility that you don't know that driver and good things may happen, and the driver is assuming personal responsibility that they don't know you. That's the benefit of the Uber and Lyft app, that they identify. Essentially, Uber and Lyft are what we call platform firms. They're the middlemen. They have customers on both sides. It's a two-sided market. They have to please customers, the passengers, and they have to please customers on the other side, the drivers. And so by pleasing both of them and vetting them and providing that element of safety, I think that what is happening, and I'm less worried about the complete lack of regulation in a couple cities in Florida as a result.
Along similar lines, one of the things that taxi cab companies in particular say about new regulations about transportation network companies is that they're going to create an unfair playing field, whereas the regulations might be less strict for the Lyfts and the Ubers of the world, and they say it requires much more for us to get operating. We have to pay more licensing fees. We have to do more certifications and all this kind of thing. How reasonable is that argument? And if there is merit to it, what can we do about it?
Well, I think what the transportation network companies did was they made a market this big and they made it this big. So I believe there's always going to be a market for taxis. I mean, you walk out of a bar, you hop in a taxi. That is easier than Uber. If there's a taxi sitting right there, that's easier. So I think there's going to be a market for that and at the airport for taxis. But I lost my entire train.
I'll jump in while you think about it then. So again, this just comes down to generality of application. There does need to be a level playing field for everyone who's providing a certain kind of service. And so I look at this as a really great opportunity across the U.S. to do away with terrible regulations that have been in place for over 80 years. and that we don't know exactly what the future is going to look like, but we've been through some interesting times before. We've come out better as a result. And if we never would have imagined Uber 10 years ago. Like, that was not even a thing that we were capable of imagining. But it's here now. 10 years from now, we don't know what is coming either. And the key is if we want our lives to be even better 10 years from now than they are now, we need to allow that kind of innovation and entrepreneurship to thrive.
So, staying with the same train of thought, I wonder, though, so applying these regulations generally and equally, that makes a lot of sense to me. But I wonder, and Tim, you mentioned this, that there's sort of always going to be a market for sort of the taxi cab service. Are there fundamental differences between taxi cabs, limousines, and TNCs? And if there are fundamental differences, do they need different types of regulatory structures? Or, in your mind, are they basically the same thing and we can, create one system to rule them all? Sorry for the Lord of the Rings reference.
So maybe this is already, maybe I'm beating a dead horse here, but I don't think that in general there's much of a difference between limos, TNCs, taxis, charter vans. They're all providing a transportation service. There is a slight distinction between whether you are doing a pre-arranged ride, like a limo or a TNC, and a street hail. Because a street hail, you don't have the benefit of being able to know the passenger and be certain that they're not an ex-murderer. And the passenger generally doesn't have the ability to know the driver. Although branding is, like, the reason why taxis are painted yellow is because a taxi company entrepreneur in New York City about 90 years ago decided that he wanted to paint all his vehicles yellow to brand them. So you knew that when you were getting into that vehicle with that name and that color and that logo, that it was going to be providing a good service. So if at the end of the day, there's risk of a street hail. So there's potential for public safety regulations there. But at the same time, essentially what you're saying is the state is going to take it upon itself to provide these regulations and to provide this measure of safety. If you don't provide that, then essentially you're saying it's up to you. It's your safety is your own personal responsibility, and you shouldn't be taking risks of getting into cars that you don't know. And that's something that we teach. Everybody grows up learning today. So it's kind of a balancing act. People are going to either take the risks themselves, or if they feel it's a public safety issue, the state can regulate it. It's a matter of what each culture, what each state, what each community feels is appropriate.
Thoughts, Tim?
Yeah, I think there's more of a difference between limousines, charter buses, taxis, and rideshare. Is because rideshare, a lot of people use it as their primary source of transportation. To where taxis was really never the purpose of taxis. And then, charter buses and limos, those are mainly for parties and planned trips somewhere. So I think the biggest distinction there is that ride-sharing companies provide sometimes a primary source of transportation for a lot of people, but to where taxis is either a planned event or hailing a random car for a trip somewhere.
Great. I've got two last questions, one for each of you. Feel free to weigh in, both of you, on either one. But Michael, I wonder if you could answer how many states we were just talking about the applying the regulation across all the different transportation services equally. Have other states taken that approach, and has there been any lessons that we could learn from their experience?
I haven't. So in most cases, it's just been a matter of the states creating a new designation of transportation services, a TNC, and that you shall use a cell phone app to connect, or some sort of digital connection service via the internet. And so no, it hasn't been, that's part of the problem, that it's, once again, we're just kind of segmenting the industry. The best example of where this actually has been done is in Melbourne, Florida, where the city council was going to regulate Uber and Lyft at the behest of the taxi industry, and then they kind of shook themselves awake and came to their senses, and they're like, these really are the same sorts of things. We may use them for different purposes, whether we're going to work or we're just into town and coming from the airport, but it's, at the end of the day, it's all transportation service. So let's completely deregulate taxis. And they did put other regulations in place on for-hire drivers. So if you want to be a for-hire company in the city of Melbourne, you do have to meet minimum standards for regulation, but they're really minimum standards, and they put the onus for public safety and making sure that you have the right drivers on the companies themselves. So in my opinion, if you're going to have any regulations at all, Melbourne, Florida is probably the model right now.
And Tim, I was wondering if you could give, you mentioned during your presentation the importance of getting this sort of regulations, getting these regulations right, especially from your perspective as somebody who's actively in this realm. Can you talk about your opinion of the current legislation that's being debated right now in Michigan, and what you think about it?
Like comparing both of them?
Yeah, or I mean, you know, what's your stance on those different approaches?
I think the House bill obviously is the better bill. It provides a blanket regulatory structure for transportation networks across Michigan and all the cities. Currently there's nothing, so there's drivers sometimes getting pulled over in Ann Arbor and getting tickets, like $1,000 tickets. But to where I think the other bill is, it regulates it too much. It treats it like a taxi. There won't be a steady regulation like for every city. I think in that bill, there's cities still might not be able to allow Uber. I'm assuming if for the Senate bill. So you might be able to get an Uber in, say, Ypsilanti, but not in Ann Arbor. You can get one in Detroit, but you can't get one in Royal Oak. So I think the House bill is just a much better bill.
All right, well, thank you both for your comments and for carrying the load here. We only had 67% of our participants, so thanks for the extra amount of work you did there. And thank you all again for coming. I just want to let you all know of if you haven't heard of our app that we have called Vote Spotter. You should check it out. It's available on the Google Play and the Apple App Store. It allows you to stay in direct communication with your legislator. As they vote on bills, you will get a notification, and you can vote on their vote. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And then also at the back of the room, we have more information about this issue, and then also publications that the Mackinac Center has produced on other issues that you might be interested in as well. So thank you all again for coming, and we'll see you next time.